All right, we're in the final week of this study where we're focusing on what it looks like to transform the heart of a city. We've been remembering our own stories. We've been thinking about what God calls us to do as a collective community. And then last week we focused on what a city transformed actually looks like. Today we're going to talk about more tangibly how we're called to live into the future that God has for us, a future filled with hope. And one of the things that we know is that Jesus, He leads us by example. Jesus shows us the way, the truth, the life, is what we read in Scripture. But more than that, He lives His life on display for all of the world to see. One of my favorite accounts of the Last Supper comes as Jesus, He kneels before His disciples before the meal is set. And He bows down on one knee and He begins to wash by towel and basin His disciples' feet before they eat. And as He prepares them and models for them what a life of service looks like, what a life of humility looks like, what a life of sacrificial love looks like, as He models that for them, He follows up that meal. The after supper prayer becomes a command. It says, "This is a new command I give to you, that you love one another the way I first love you. And it's by this that people will know that you're my disciples, by your willingness to love the same way that I first love you," Jesus says. He does that after showing them what it looks like to wash feet, but then He goes forth from that place, after that Last Supper, to display what a broken heart actually looks like. As He's hung on that tree, as He dies a death by crucifixion, naked, exposed, broken, He models sacrificial love to the fullest expression. This is the kind of love that God calls us to. A love that will lay down our life for our friends. A love that will lead the way for all of the world to see, so that people will come to know Christ through our willingness to sacrifice and to love with the same extravagant generosity as God has first for us. And that's what we're called to participate in right now. That's what God is calling us to consider and to contemplate. Sacrificial generosity, extravagant love. As we think about the future steps for Resurrection Downtown as it pertains to transforming the heart of this city, one of the things that we know is that it's going to require sacrifice. It's going to require extravagant generosity that we haven't fully experienced before. We're a young church, and so we haven't walked through this process, but this piece of property, this next step, this new building, this ability to make more room for people who come into this city so that they can be transformed and sent out, it's going to require everything we have and all that we are. And that's what I want to finish with today, is what does that look like? And how do we make those decisions? And rather than inviting you through a whole bunch of scenarios for you to think about and to discuss, I want you to know what Wendy and I are thinking about. How we're walking through this process of determining how God is calling us to sacrifice and to commit to making possible this future that God has for us. Making possible our ability to live into this mission of transforming the heart of the city. The first time Wendy and I ever did this, we had to make decisions where we had to tighten up our budget, and we had to find alternative income streams so that we could have an offering to give to build the Crosstown Station, to transform it from a bar into a church. At that time, our commitment was challenging because we weren't making a large sum of money. This one will be equally as challenging for those of you who are interested in knowing. At that time, we had to think about what our commitment would look like, and we had to make sacrifices. I had just moved here from Detroit. My whole family lived within 5 minutes of each other in Detroit, and as they were there, I had to think about cutting that lifeline. And that lifeline for me at the time was cable television, my cable subscription, because my cable subscription enabled me to watch all of my Detroit sports that gave me the feeling of being at home. I was here in this new city away from all of my family and friends. That was my lifeline. That was the way that I felt at home. I sacrificed that for 3 years. I've continued to sacrifice that even after our 3-year commitment period that first time, but that afforded me the ability to give $3,600 to the Capital campaign so that we could move into the Crosstown Station. At the same time, Wendy sacrificed something else. We had this custom where we would go out on date nights once a month. And that once a month date night would equal about $100. Wendy would like to go out to these nicer restaurants and do that just one time a month. And so we decided to give that up for three years. That's another $3,600 that we were able to commit to make possible the transformation of Crosstown Station. At the same time, I met in a coffee shop a publisher who offered me an opportunity to write a book. I asked the publisher if I'd be willing, or he would be willing to allow me to share the proceeds of that book to the church as an offering. And he said, absolutely, which afforded me another $5,500 to give so that we could build Christian community in the heart of this city. That totaled over $12,000 that we were able to give on top of what we had already been pledged to tithe to the everyday annual operating campaign of this church. And I have to be honest, when I'm telling you, as we were making those decisions as to how it was that we were going to give sacrificially in that way, it was painful. It was frustrating. It was a little unnerving. Wendy would have given way, way more. I was hoping to conserve and to save way, way more. And so it was a tough process to get there, but God draws us into those conversations, into that tension to live sacrificially and to give in the same way. And so as we made that commitment, we did so apprehensively, but at the same time trusting that God would be faithful. And sure enough, God was faithful. In that same time, over 80 households did the very same thing, walked through the very same process. We raised together $1.6 million. We were able to purchase and renovate the Crosstown Station, which is where we've seen almost tenfold growth since that moment, since that commitment, since that willingness to live sacrificially, to do the things that God does. God is always faithful when we take those risks, when we take a step out of loving and living and giving with extravagant generosity. As Wendy and I think about it now, we've been thinking about this through our next steps as a church as we consider purchasing just over 2 acres of property and building our first building, the first ever church building in over 80 years in downtown Kansas City, the first Methodist building in over 100 years in this city. As we contemplate this once-a-century event that God is calling us into for such a time as this, we've been having that same kind of wrestling match, that same kind of conversation about how is God calling us to be a part of this now, to live sacrificially now. As we've been thinking about it, it's been causing some sort of angst because we have this new addition in our family. His name is Freddie. Had Freddie not been here, I think we would have been much more equipped and ready to run this race that is set before us. But now we have another person to consider. And so we've been going back and forth in this same kind of process. And all we keep on thinking is that the gifts that God gives us are to be given freely with great joy. And this gift that we've been given in Freddie is a gift that causes all sorts of complications, and yet we consider them all to be pure joy because it's something that God gave us first. And so as we think about our gift, we're trying to think about all that we've been given and not to give it away reluctantly and to give it away in ways that make us feel bad, cause angst, but to give it away as joyfully as possible because it was a gift that was given to us first. And so before we ever had Freddie, the only child that we've ever had was this community, was this church, Resurrection Downtown. And so for the next 3 years, we're going to consider Resurrection Downtown as though it is one of our children. We're calculating the totals on what it would cost to put another child through daycare just with Freddie. We're going to calculate the cost of what it would cost to put diapers on this second child for a period of time just like Freddie. What the increased food expense might be and all of those other things that go along with it. Because we've taken on that responsibility with great joy. And so how exciting to be able to do it again for the next 3 years. That's how we're going to give and live as sacrificially as we can, in a way that would make possible the future that God has for us, a future filled with hope, to live into this picture of what we understand to be a transformed city. And so as we think about this, and as you think about this and pray through this, I want to invite you just to ask that question, God, how are you calling me to give and to live with equal sacrifice? How are you calling me to do the things that you do because you promise me that I am able to do those things? I'm able to do even greater things, you say. How are you calling me to be a part of transforming this city by building Christian community with everything I have and all that I am? Please know that I'm going to be praying for you this week as you think through this question and as you join in response to God's gift He's given you by sharing them sacrificially and generously.